Hey guys, what is up? Public here back with a video, and today we have lots to talk about. There is a new mini little rework coming to Shadow Priest in 11.2, the next upcoming patch. So we'll get this for the start of Season 3. So in this video, I'm going to go over as much of the changes as I can and kind of my initial reaction with a lot of this stuff. We're not going to talk a whole lot about sims and numbers and kind of optimal builds and that kind of thing. That's still actively being worked on. Sailor and myself are putting lots of hours into getting SimC updated and kind of testing out the changes on PTR itself. So that will be coming in a future video. We're just going to be talking about the changes in this call. Now, one thing we're not going to discuss as well is kind of the tier set changes. The tier sets that are coming are for Archon and Void Weaver specifically, so a little bit of a new thing they're doing. I just need some more time to evaluate them and talk about them, so that will also be coming in a future video, hopefully this week, to give my feedback on that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and check out the changes to Shadow Priest coming next patch. Alright, so there's a lot to go over. If you haven't already seen, there is a blog post that I have on this Book of Shadows site that kind of goes over basically the highlights of what's changed and a little bit of feedback. So I'll reference this a couple times throughout this video, but this is probably a better snapshot of what's actually happening compared to looking at the patch notes. So we will start with these and kind of go through them, and I'll kind of bounce back and forward. So one thing I'll note, that there was kind of a mention here. They have a couple goals that they're kind of working through. The biggest thing to keep in mind is this is a mid-expansion rework. Typically with those, they're not going to go as heavy-handed with things as they would for a full expansion rework. So, and we've definitely seen that with this. So a lot of this was talent tree focused. The base spec itself didn't get many changes. The class tree is unchanged. The hero talents are unchanged. And in fact, the talent tree is actually exactly the same for the first 4 rows, and a couple of the rows haven't changed as well. So they're really kind of working on the middle fluff of our talent tree. A lot of the stuff is not super gameplay impacting, although there are a few exceptions. So just keep that in mind. It's not what I would call, full-flown rework. I think it's definitely, we're getting changes, but it's not quite at, hey, the spec plays completely differently now. The core of how the spec has been playing will still be the same in 11.2. And they kind of went out with that with this goal in mind. A little bit of this is with Shadow Crash, some procs trying to make the spec simpler. So we'll see how they've done with that. So yeah, they mentioned several talents have changed positions in the tree. There is a couple things there we'll talk about because some of this is kind of a weird choice, but it is what it is. Okay, so we're just going to kind of go one by one and kind of talk through this. So one of the first new talents is Dark Thoughts. They actually mentioned this above. They've brought back a lot of procs and effects from old tier sets, including Dark Thoughts. So straight up, just increases the chance for Shadowy Insight to occur, and then that Mind Blast that consumes it generates 1 additional Insanity. So if you look on the tree itself, they've, again, moved a little bit of stuff here. So Shadowy Insight now builds into Dark Thoughts, so you can kind of double down on Dark Thoughts if that's something that you want to do. Probably the most particular relevancy for this is Void Weaver builds, right? When you do care about getting those resets within the Entropic Rift windows. Although, kind of feels a little weak. It's not that strong on the surface, so we'll see kind of how this plays out. But yeah, that's that guy. Okay, and then Death's Torment is also coming back. So this is back from a Mirror Sill where we had the echoed tiers with Shadow Word Death. So this is, again, they kind of put it in a pretty good spot. So off of Death Speaker is now Death's Torment, where Shadow Word Death deals an additional hits additional 2 times at 15% effectiveness, right? So you get that 1 hit of Shadow Word Death, and then it auto casts itself 2 times later. This is really kind of an interaction-based talent, right? So we care a lot about, hitting with Inescapable Torment or proccing other things like Depth of Shadows. So really, it's the damage of Death itself is not the big thing here. It's really all the interactions with Death outside of it. And again, placed outside of Death Speaker. Okay, next new talent is Madness Weaving. So this replaced Mastermind where it was in the tree. It kind of it's a little hard to read, to be honest. It's not the most clear spell in the game. And it's right down here off of Death Speaker and Mindbender. So what this does is it effectively makes our mastery better. That's the way you want to read this. So normally, every time that you have a dot active, your damage dealt is increased by your mastery percentage, right? So if you have 10% mastery and you have 3 dots active, your spells are going to do 30% more damage. Now, with Madness Weaving, what this is saying is, for that dot component for Devouring Plague, it's now up to 50% better, right? So that's kind of the way that this works out, depending on if Devouring Plague is active. And this does also work with Void Form, so you get this benefit for free during Void Form itself. Not the biggest fan. I mean, it's kind of a boring node, to be honest, and it reads kind of awkwardly, but that's fine. I think strength aside of the talent, it's also kind of in a weird spot because it's going into N'Zoth, and I don't know, but we'll kind of, it's hard to take this into account until you look at the full tree. So, but yes, another new 2-point node at the bottom there. Next new talent is Void Volley. This guy is really, really cool. So we're actually going to jump onto PTR. I'm going to show you how this works. All right, so on the PTR, I just have like a random build where I've selected a bunch of random stuff. The thing that we're going to talk about real quick is Void Volley. So this actually replaced Malediction on the tree. So Void Torrent baseline is a 30-second cooldown. And then off of that is a new active ability called Void Volley. Now, the way this works is when you press Void Torrent, the button actually changes to Void Volley for the next 20 seconds, okay? So it's not a separate keybind. It doesn't have its own cooldown. It's just attached to you pressing Void Torrent. It itself generates Insanity, fires bolts. It's mostly a priority target spell. When you hit this, you also get another Idol of Cthulhu proc. It's also buffed by Insidious Ire. So more or less, things that function with Void Torrent also function with Void Volley. So the way that this works, you press Void Torrent. You can see I now have Void Volley where it was. And then I can press it again. You see I get my free Cthulhu proc, and it slams into the main target. It's very similar to kind of Void Eruption in terms of those animations. It releases volley of Void Bolts, 10 bolts at your main target, and then 1 bolt at all enemies within 10 yards of that target. So basically that Void Bolt range dealing damage. This thing hits really hard too, and I think it's really fun. Especially, now you're pressing Void Torrent more often, so the talent gets a little bit nicer. I don't know. I think it looks pretty sweet, and it is kind of another instant cast ability that you can use on the move, which is nice as well. I know the spec has kind of felt locked in a little bit there, so definitely a pretty cool addition of Void Volley into the spec. Okay, back into the notes. Couple new talents to go over still. So the next one is Subservient Shadows. This just says summon minions, last an additional 3 seconds, and deal additional 15% damage. They put this on the far left-hand side of the tree. Now, the thing that will probably throw you off, and it even threw me off when I first read this, because it's like leading into Mindbender and all this stuff, but it reads summon minions. So this actually works with Shadow Fiend, Mindbender, Idol of Cthulhu Tendrils, and Idol of Yogg-Saron. This thing is a very powerful point. Your Yogs are lasting longer, each Cthulhu Tendril is lasting longer, and they're dealing more damage. One of the best new talents that we have in the tree power-wise by far. And definitely anytime we're playing a pet build, which is, we take kind of Cthulhu all of the time, but even then, if you're going with a Yogg or Yashar's, yeah, this is a great talent. Absolutely cranks. Okay, next up we have a couple, I call these more filler talents to talk through. Phantom Menace and Instilled Doubt. So again, these are kind of in the middle of the tree. Phantom Menace increases the critical strike chance of shadowy apparitions and their critical strike damage by 40%. And then Instilled Doubt, kind of similar, crit strike chance of Vamp Touch and Shadowed Pain, and their critical strike damage by 40%. So they are trying to have us incentivize like more crit focused talents a little bit more. So which was sorely missing from the build. So that's what these were doing here. Now, one thing to note, I think it's later in the patch notes, if you're kind of a keen observer among you. If you didn't know, Shadowy Apparitions actually did not critically strike as it stands right now on live. So the reason for that was it actually copied the state of whatever generated the apparition. Okay, so if Mind Blast crit and generated a Shadowy Apparition, that Shadowy Apparition would do double damage, i.e. critting. This was kind of awkward because it led to weird interactions because it didn't actually show a crit in the log or how it functioned. So they've since scrapped all that and went back to, hey, Shadowy Apparition is just now its own independent chance to crit, which is how a talent like Phantom Menace can actually function. This is also important for other reasons, but yeah, they've kind of gone back to that old style of how that crits. Overall positive. I think it makes the game better telegraphed and that kind of stuff as well, which is great. Moving on, so let's talk about Shadow Crash and Descending Darkness. So if you didn't already notice, Shadow Crash has been moved to the right side of the tree. Now, they still have 2 points, but Whispering Shadows has been removed. So that's the thing that actually gave Shadow Crash the dot applicator, and they just baked that in to Shadow Crash by itself, which is nice because now you don't need 2 points for Shadow Crash to be worth ever taking. So that's nice from like a point efficiency perspective. Now, they also gave Shadow Crash 2 charges, which is something a lot of us have been talking about as like a nice quality of life change to the spec, especially for like lower key type stuff. In big high key environments, you're really not going to notice a big difference with 2 charges. But I think for lower stuff and for the vast majority of the player base, it's a nice quality of life change to have this. Now, to compensate for that, they also, or I guess in addition to that, they also made it a 15-second cooldown, but it only dots 6 targets now. So a little bit of a change up to what it was before, but it's recharging a little bit faster, and it has 2 charges to give you a bit more options there. So we'll still be weaving in vampiric touches and manually dotting where we can, but in AoE, should be overall a nice quality of life jump. Now with this, there is a new talent that builds off of Shadow Crash called Descending Darkness, which just increases the damage of Shadow Crash by 300%. That's a big number, a big modifier. I'm not a big fan of this, personally. I think Shadow Crash functions as a dot applicator spell, and making it a damage spell kind of, it's just weird, right? Because then you're kind of in this weird spot of like, well, I want to use Shadow Crash for damage, but I should hold it to dot ads that are coming soon. And I don't think that's a very healthy relationship. So hopefully we can get some, adjustments to this, because yeah, that just feels like a weird design change to add that talent in. But there it is. Okay, I think that's all the new talents to cover. Now let's go into the reworked talents. So a lot of talents have actually changed up how they function. Dark Evangelism is up first. Dark Evangelism is no longer a buff, so it's no buff to track. It's just quite simply your periodic spell damage is increased by 6%. So okay, there's the one less thing to track or care about. Not that we really did a whole lot anyways, but there it is. Next up, Death Speaker has been redesigned. This is somewhat controversial. Death Speaker has been used quite a lot, and it's kind of a nice little movement proc that we get to use to make Shadow or Death relevant to press throughout an encounter rather than just inside of execute. They recognize that the proc's just a little too much in the spec, so they've redesigned it and said, hey, Shadow or Death damage is now just flat increased by 25%, and the execute threshold has been upped to 35% instead of 20%. So as soon as you start getting Twist of Fate, Shadow or Death becomes pressable as well. Going to be a little weird because my muscle memory is very 20% for Shadow or Death, and it's just completely passive. There's no proc anymore. Now, unfortunately, the big question we had with Death Speaker is, does that function with Depths of Shadows? If you don't know, this is a Void Weaver talent which says Shadow Death has a high chance to summon a Shadow Fiend or Mindbender, whatever your current pet is, when damaging targets below 20% health. Death Speaker did work with this before it was reworked, but now it does not work, okay? So even though Shadow or Death gets that execute threshold at 35%, you don't start getting the increased proc chance of Depth of Shadows unless you're below 20%. So we have this weird zone of 35 to 20 is half execute, and then below 20 gets you everything, at least for Void Weaver with this talent. Hopefully they can fix that up, because that's super awkward and confusing. Okay, next up, let's cover the idols. So a couple of our idols got changed. The first one is Yashiraj to cover. So this one is really, really weird. This is our kind of pet idol. It builds off of Bender, Inescapable Torment, all that stuff. But they changed it to just be a haste proc. So it's just your damaging spells have a chance to increase your haste by 15%. And then when that ends, you then get negative haste, negative 10% haste for 8 seconds. So it's kind of like a Whispers in the Dark trinket back from Legion, I think it was. This thing is super undertuned. You barely notice these procs either way. And it's just kind of randomly in the tree, off of Bender, off of Madness Weaving. I don't know. It just seems super weird and not something that, I'm the biggest fan of personally. Haste procs are fine, I guess. This is kind of we do kind of have that haste proc with our current tier set, but I don't know. Even without the negative aspect, it's pretty underwhelming, pretty boring. And I kind of figured this would be a pet-focused, idol or capstone talent just because it feeds off of the Bender stuff. And I don't know. Just feels really weird to me. Didn't quite understand that. Okay, the next one, and this one is a doozy. This is Idol of N'Zoth has been redesigned. So the tooltip is honestly really hard to read, so I'm going to swap back over and show you how this works in game. So basically, throw everything out that you knew about N'Zoth. It's totally different now. Basically, now what happens is every time you press an ability on a target and you cast something, you get stacks of horrific visions. Now, by itself, this does nothing, right? It's not a dot or anything. It's just a debuff on that singular target. And basically, there's two interactions that happen. But, every spell you're casting gives some X amount of stacks. Some spells give more stacks than others. I think Devouring Plague gives the most at 12 or something like that. Void Bolt also gives quite a lot. And basically, there's two interactions that happen. And again, forgive the tooltip, it's really confusing. One happens at 50 stacks, and one happens at 100 stacks. And basically, they're just, different versions of each other. So at 50 stacks, you get a 3-second dot on that target, and you get an initial burst of damage onto that target, and then it gets you insanity over a couple seconds. Same thing once you hit 100 stacks. So then it expires itself, deals damage, and gives you insanity over 3 seconds. So basically, the one at 50 is like a mini version of the one that happens at 100. And this is only going to happen on your primary target, right? So if you are in an AoE environment, right, and we shadow crash all of these guys, only my main target is getting that debuff for N'Zoth, okay? Now, what's kind of interesting with that is it's kind of playing into the priority target damage of the spec, that at least that profile that we have inside of AoE. But even on single target, it has value because you're getting that insanity from it too, which is super, super valuable. And the other thing, which is a little interesting, I was kind of surprised that it worked this way. When you get these stacks at 50 and at 100, and the insanity buff is hidden, but it is happening. The N'Zoth hits actually psychic link other targets. So the actual explosions that happen at 50 and 100 stacks do psychic link to all targets. So this talent has a little bit of single insanity generation. It's got psychic link cleaving. It's pretty awesome, honestly. It's a great rework, one of my favorite new talents that they've kind of messed with, and really kind of doubles down on what we've already been good at, which is that priority target. So one thing is, we're going to be a little disincentivized to swapping targets, right? Because your stacks don't move at all, or if the target dies or anything. Now, if you are casting on 2 targets, right? Like if you're swapping around, you can build up stacks on more than one target, but that is effectively moving out where those explosions happen. So you can kind of keep it up if you really wanted to, but it's really not something you're going to get a whole lot of benefit doing. You don't no psychic link hits are going to extend that on the other target or anything. So it's really incentivizing us to find that main target and prio off of it, which is what we've already been doing for most things anyway. It's just rewarding you for being able to pick that highest health target, stick with it for the duration of that pull or whatever else is happening. All right, next up, the next thing to cover, and I kind of buried this a little bit. A lot of you have probably already seen this. Let's talk about Mind Spike and some of this stuff. They've removed Mind Spike. If you didn't already notice, it's gone from the tree, so we no longer have Mind Spike. Everything is flay based, okay? So there's no longer like a choose your own filler type of thing. I was kind of disappointed they didn't also remove Dark Ascension because it's still a non-periodic shadow damage thing, but now our fillers or empowered fillers don't actually get buffed by Dark Ascension. That whole thing is just super weird. I don't know why they've kept this at this point. In my opinion, they should have either also removed Dark Ascension or made Dark Ascension transform Flay into Spike while it's active. They didn't do either of those things. They did, however, it's now buffed from 20% up to 25% for Dark Ascension. So they did make it a little bit more powerful, but that's kind of compensated by Mind Spike not actually working with it anymore because it doesn't exist. So Mind Flay is now the thing, and anything that did exist for Mind Spike no longer works. It's all Mind Flay based. So the first thing that you'll cover, right, is this new talent called Shattered Psyche. This is effectively a reworked version of Mind Melt, which just says ticks of Mind Flay or damage of Mind Flays increase the critical strike chance of Mind Blast by 8%, stacking up to 12 times. So there's just kind of a reworked version of Mind Melt that works with Mind Flay. So that's still in the build. This is mostly going to be like a Void Weaver type thing. And it's a choice node with Mental Decay, which was also buffed a little bit, that just, increased the damage of Mind Flay by 15%. So yeah, fillers got a lot simpler. There's no choice anymore. It's just all Mind Flay all the time. Okay, we already talked about Shadow Crash. All that stuff is the same. Void Torrent baseline 30 seconds. Again, Malediction was made a permanent addition. Let's see. Shadow Apparition can critically strike. We covered that. They did a little bit of tuning to Mind Flay. Part of this, I think, was because of just the sheer strength of Mind Flay. Insanity got a little crazy as Archon. So they nerfed the amount of insanity that Mind Flay Insanity gives you, and then baseline buffed Mind Flay itself. So this is overall, I think it's like a good 3 insanity per tick of Mind Flay, and then 2 for Mind Flay Insanity. So both these are, you know, again, it's balancing wise. It's not balanced against Mind Spike anymore, so they can do things like this, and it's fine. And again, I think this correctly pulls a little power out of this spell, particularly for Archon, at least from like a global damaging balancing perspective. They've also changed, like I said, Dark Ascension, they got that slight buff. Mind Devour is now a 1-point talent, so if you didn't notice, they also moved it down here and just made it a 1-pointer. I think this is fine. Like the 2 points difference wasn't that big of a deal, so they kind of made the 2-point default here. So that is kind of nice. I already mentioned Void Volley also worked with Insidious Ire and Idol of Cthulhu, which is nice. And they also changed how Tormented Spirits work. So this is a big point of feedback. In addition to adding extra pathing nodes into Yogg Saron, they also made Tormented Spirits work a little differently. So they've said that, okay, it's still your Shadow Word Pain damage is a chance to create apparitions, but the really important part here is that this proc chance now scales depending on how many Shadow Word Pains that you currently have active. So very similar, if you didn't know, Auspicious Spirits and Maddening Touch have the same kind of thing where depending on how many targets you're facing, you get less procs, or less, you know, the procs are still being saturated by more targets, but it's not like the proc chance is flat like it was before. So there's not as much ridiculous scaling on Tormented Spirits as you add targets. It still gives you more procs as you add targets. It's just not, you know, doubling or whatever, exponentially crazily increasing the amount of procs that you're getting. And then, again, kind of playing off of the new crit chance with Shadowy Apparitions, Critical Strikes and double this proc chance. So overall, definitely a solid addition of Tormented Spirits. We're still doing testing as far as what that means. They also made it a 1-point talent, so I think, again, all these are great changes. With this as well, I think we covered all these. Malediction became baseline. Mind Spike is gone. Whispering Shadows is baseline. The other thing that was removed was Unfurling Darkness. So anyone that was a fan of that talent, she's gone. Arguably, it was a nice little movement talent, but it did kind of feel a little out of place. It seems like they're kind of wanting us to use Shadow Crash as the replacement. Like with this, like it's refreshing dots like Unfurling does. Descending Darkness gives you that damage as well. So, I don't know. It's kind of a weird spot. Not sure how I feel about that overall, but that's what they've done. Okay, let's cover kind of just overall stuff to make sure I covered everything as far as what has exactly changed. So, we covered all this stuff. A couple of things we're still trying to work out. I think the biggest thing is just not what they changed, but what they didn't change. So, the utility choice in this top section is still a problem, right? So, you either choose between Mental Fortitude or Silence, or you drop some point that's damaged to get both. That's still a problem. They should have made Silence or Dispersion baseline or both baseline. I don't know why they're still avoiding that. That was easily the biggest thing that we wanted to see change within the spec. So really sad they didn't do that. I slightly covered this before, but Shadow Fiend and Mindbender damage has not been buffed since Dragonflight. And this is really important because they have been upping our damage of our Shadow Priest Aura spell, right? So when they say in previous patch notes throughout the War Within, when they're like, okay, hey, all Shadow Priest damage increased by 5% or whatever it is. None of those have ever worked with Shadow Fiend or Mindbender melee damage, which is the entire, like, it's you're not compensating buffing the spec with this, which heavily disincentivize using these talents and using pet builds. So one big thing with this, if you're going to look at our talent tree, I think balancing this correctly is a better move. Definitely something they should have looked at, but is missing in this. Now, this is, I mean, we're going on hundreds of days, and where they said, hey, we're looking at Dark Ascension versus Void Eruption and kind of the lack of identity of our cooldowns here. Nothing changed here, right? Like they did buff Dark Ascension, but they removed Mind Spike, which was that kind of like natural synergy of like you wanted to play Spike with Dark Ascension, and that's just gone. So if anything, it's gotten worse. So yeah, this still needs to be looked at. Simplest thing, in my opinion, is just to remove Dark Ascension or put something else there. But yeah, that didn't really come in this patch. The other thing was also missing is just movement or displacement improvements in general. This is still kind of a problem. We lost Death Speaker, which was a proc that helped out with this. I don't know, just kind of a mess in my opinion. A couple other things I'll mention is there are some weird pathing problems that I hope that they look at as well. Like, for example, Dark Evangelism is pathed only off of Shadow Crash, which feels kind of random. Madness Weaving is just like a random mastery buff that's off of Bender, Death Speaker, into N'Zoth, and I don't know, it's just like randomly placed here. Similarly with Yashiraj, like this is just a random haste proc off of pet talents. Don't really see why it fits where it does. Pathing's not perfect by any means. It will never be perfect, but those are the big things that stand out to me. There's some other minor stuff, which was like Subservient Shadows, which is like a pet damage thing. Mostly buffs Yogg and Cthulhu, but those are on the opposite side of the tree. Shadowy Insight, Dark Thoughts, very Mind Blast stuff with Mastermind in here as well. But Insidious Ire is over here. So, like, I don't know, like the groupings of stuff are in a little bit of a weird spot for me. Obviously, like, we don't necessarily need to have all things that deal with each other in the same section of the tree, but I think loosely organized a little bit better would be nice to see. And we didn't get much of that. So, like I said, we'll cover the tier set in a future video. And if you want to see kind of more in-depth thoughts, I've kind of listed all of this here. This has also all been posted to the forums as well, so there will be threads linked in the description. If you want to give your own feedback, feel free to check that stuff out. But that's all we have to talk about in this video. I know it's kind of somewhat brief, as much as I really could. So hopefully this week we'll get a video about the tier sets, and then we'll have a bit more info about like builds and that kind of thing. Hopefully before raid testing starts this week, so we'll see how that goes. If you didn't already know, I try to stream raid testing on my Twitch channel, which is also linked down below. I'll be kind of on and off streaming those with the raid testing coming up as well, so you can see how these changes feel like in action. Okay? Thank you so much for watching. A little bit later than usual, but we got it figured out. So catch you guys later.